quote here from a pretty prominent economist, and they say that Labour needs to provide an alternative to aggressive policies being prioritised by the Conservative. The banks and those earning more than £100,000 could quite easily contribute a little more, and unless they do, inequality and poverty will inevitably soar in the months and years ahead. Do you agree with that statement?
The way that I believe that you can reduce inequality, reduce poverty, and actually also improve the living standards of ordinary working people, not in poverty, but struggling to get by, is through growing the economy. Because that is the way that we can ensure that working people have more money in their pockets and we have more money for public services. And one of the real failures over these last 13 years is to grow our economy in all parts of the country, creating those good quality, high-paid jobs. So my priority is to get that economic growth back in our economy, to lift people out of poverty and to have the money we need to invest in our schools and our hospitals and so much else of the public realm, which has been, decimated, frankly, by this Conservative government.
Well, let's bring in another caller who's got a similar point to make. Phil in Broadstairs. Hello, Phil.
Good evening, Ian. Hello, Rachel. Yes,
Hi, Phil.
In sort of answer to that last call, or adding to it, you said you came into politics to change things, and yet all I've heard from you and the front bench is Tory policies for a Tory crisis. You're not going to tax wealth. You're not going to do much with income tax. You're leaving the profits of the banks, the water and the energy untouched. I remember very well, because I was born in that period, the Attlee government. And what they came in with was a four-letter word, hope. You aren't communicating hope. There is no ambition in evidence in what you're doing. And they had a much harder job than you've got to rebuild the country after the Second World War. COVID is bad. 2008 was terrible. But austerity has to be stopped. And you seem to be wanting to carry on worshipping the Treasury, because you are an ex-banker, Bank of England banker, and you don't seem to be in making any kind of ambition clear to me as a voter, or the public as voters, whether you're prepared to rise to these challenges, which are far worse than what we had in World War II.
So what's your actual question?
Well, the question is, why are you employing Tory policies to deal with a Tory crisis?
Well, I mean, just going back to Helena's question, the economist that she quoted, that was actually you.
Well, look, I mean, I want to reduce poverty and inequality. I didn't go into politics, but how do you do that? What are the practical things that we can do?
Well, your suggestion in that quote was to tax the banks more and those earning more than £100,000 more, but you've gone back on that.
Well, look, the way that I think that we can lift people out of poverty and reduce inequality, as I say, is to get the economy growing, and that has been the missing ingredient these last 13 years. Now, Phil sort of says, oh, I'm an ex-banker. Yes, I am an ex-Bank of England economist, and the one thing I learned more than anything at the Bank of England is your sums have always got to add up. And what we saw less than a year ago was a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who decided to throw that very simple truth that your sums have got to add up out of the window. And where does that leave us?
First anniversary of Liz Truss today.
First anniversary today. And the damage that was done in those 44 or whatever it is, short days, is immense. And that damage was done because she thought the rules of economics didn't apply to her, and so did Kwasi Kwarteng. And we have paid a heavy price for that experiment. And I will never play fast and loose with the public finances, because the people who pay the consequences of that are ordinary working people and some of the poorest people in society, who are now facing higher rents, higher mortgages, almost the collapse of the UK pension market because of their ideological experiment. And I will never do that. That responsibility, fiscal and economic stability, always has to come first, and it will with me.
But if you're just going to follow Tory economic policy, what's the point of voting Labour?
Well, we've said that we would get rid of the non-dom tax status. I haven't heard Rishi Sunak calling for that. I wonder why. We've said that there would be VAT on private school fees, and we would put that money where it belongs, in our state schools. We've said that private equity bosses, their income should be taxed as income and not capital gains, and we would put that money into our public services. And we've said that we would have a proper windfall tax on the huge profits that the energy companies are making, and help with the cost of living crisis.
Said
none of the Tories wouldn't do any of those things.
You're not going to increase income tax for the so-called rich. You're not going to increase capital gains tax. You're not going to increase inheritance tax. You're not going to introduce a wealth tax, even though Michael Gove is now speculating about that. I mean, you're more right-wing than Michael Gove.
Oh, give me strength. I mean, I haven't heard any Conservative member of the Cabinet saying, do you know what, Rachel's ideas on, cracking down on this loophole for non-doms, which brings in, by the way, £3.5 billion a year, or the £1.4 billion you could bring in
economists dispute that.
Well, look, the number on the non-doms comes from analysis of HMRC data from the LSE and Warwick
But they might well
University.
just leave the country, so you might not have any of that money at all.
This takes into account people's behavioural changes, Ian. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have backed up Labour's numbers on how much you would bring in from putting VAT on private school fees. And you could bring in billions of pounds by closing the loopholes, which mean that the big energy companies can get out of paying the so-called windfall tax that the government have introduced. So, I'm just not buying this idea.
What's happened
that
to
we
the
have
Rachel Reeves?
I'm sorry, let me just say this. I'm not buying this idea that our policies are somehow the same as the Conservatives. They're just not. But what I will not apologise for is making sure that our numbers add up, because unless you can do that, it will be ordinary people and the public services that we rely on that will pay the price for it.
So the Rachel Reeves who said that quote, the banks and those earning more than 100,000 could quite easily contribute a little bit more. That's a very different Rachel Reeves from the one I've got sitting in front of me.
Well, look, my priority, and I make no apology for that either, is that I want to grow the economy, because it is through growing the economy that you can sustainably improve people's living standards and have the money that our public services desperately need.